Thank you all for joining us this morning. We have Rob Castiglione here on the line as well from FRA. But I'm going to do a quick introduction of myself before I pass it along to Rob. First of all, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Katie Inoue, and I am the owner and founder of Spark. So our goals for today, I'm going to have Rob speak first and provide some overview of the requirements. For some of us, the implementation deadlines for 243 are quickly approaching. And then with that, we'll have a question and answer time and take advantage of having Rob's time available to do that. With that, Rob, if you want to go ahead, and I will advance the slides for you, but go ahead and do an introduction and take it from here.
Okay, will do. Thank you, Katie. First of all, thank you, Katie, for pulling this all together. Again, my name is Rob Castiglione. I'm the staff director of the Human Performance Division. Our primary responsibilities in this small group that we have is really this rule, Part 243, and then confidential close call reporting, which is another big lift for our division. I wanted to say that as we do get close to this implementation date, I wanted to put people's minds at ease. We're not out to punish anybody or come with our guns drawn or our ticket book drawn. That's not how we operate in this division. I know you may have had some experiences like that with particularly the enforcement side of FRA. That's not to say that we won't do some enforcement if it's needed. Let's make that clear. But this is a new rule, and we have every intention of essentially bending over backwards to help you get in compliance. We certainly don't want to be heavy-handed. We won't be heavy-handed. We will do what we have to do to get folks in compliance, and I think the Class 1s are pretty much there, and based on what I've heard, based on what I've seen, based on what I know that you guys already do, but everything from the Class 1s on down to the mom and pop operations, whether it be a small railroad or a small contractor, you're both employers. Unfortunately, the rule applies the same to everybody, whether you're a big organization or a small organization. There are some allowances for smaller organizations in terms of rule application, but for the most part, the moving parts that are required for compliance are essentially the same for everybody. I wanted to just briefly touch upon some of the highlights. Katie asked me to emphasize a few things, and that's what the focus will be here. And I will endeavor to do that now. Katie, I'm moving on to the agenda on slide 4. I'm not looking at the online version. I have an FRA machine, so it's locked down, and I can't get into the webinar that you guys are looking at. Essentially on the agenda is what we'd like to cover is the implementation dates for big and small training organizations and learning institutions. I suspect there may be some on the line. In fact, Katie is the TOLI herself, Sparks. Designation of existing employees, talk about the initial program submission, what has to come, what doesn't, periodic oversight, annual reviews. I want to talk about the compliance guide updates that were published last May. And while we're on that, if we do get some questions, and I'm hoping Katie will take some good notes for me, I can't guarantee that they will make it into the next compliance guide update, and it looks like we are going to likely have one next May. But perhaps it can make if it's a good question that would be beneficial to the industry as a whole, I don't see any reason why we couldn't include those in the compliance guide to give you guys and the industry some comfort in memorializing what our position is. Most of you probably are aware, there's another petition that the Short Line Association and the Contractors Association filed with FRA back in the summer. And then we want to have a little open discussion, time permitting. So large employers. I have no good news and no bad news to tell you with respect to the petition. I think it's appropriate to say that large employers, that date is fast approaching. So just remember that your programs, if you're an employer, whether you be a railroad, large railroad, small railroad, large contractor, small contractor, your programs are considered approved upon submission, okay? New employees generally trained to programs in place at that time, meaning that folks that come on board after January 1st, we will be expecting those folks to be trained to your program effective on that date. As the rule does provide for, I'm not supposed to use this term, but I'm going to use it anyway, grandfathering of folks that were hired prior to that date. This rule really is about, with the exception of refresher training, this rule really is about the generation of employees that are coming on board now, essentially after January 1st. Training organizations and learning institutions. This is important for you guys that that have hung a shingle or that are acting as providing a service to railroads for training, you must have your programs approved by January 1st, 2020, or you're out of business, essentially. You can continue to do it, but do it at your own peril. Basically, TO and LIs both have to have their programs approved by January 1st, 2020, and that means the folks at Overland Park that are providing services for BNSF, those that are providing that type of structure, that type of delivery training for prospective safety-related railroad employees, folks that work out of their homes that may not have a brick-and-mortar operation, they too are considered TO and LIs. And then the next date that we have coming up is September 1st, 2020, is where you declare the occupational category of your employees. I wanted to touch a little bit on this, and that just want to let you know that you don't have to get wrapped up around names or craft titles, whatever the case may be, however you bucket your employees to what they do. We just want to be able to see when we do come and look at your records and look at your documentation, we should be able to see which employees are trained where. We actually had an FAQ published in response to the second, I guess it was the first short line association. It wasn't a petition, it was a lawsuit, where they wanted to bucket their employees by CFR type. You can do that if you want to. If you don't want to call a carman or a locomotive engineer or whatever the case may be, as there are literally dozens upon dozens of traditional railroad occupational categories and crafts that we are familiar with in this industry. You use whatever you want. It's just a matter of FRA being able to say, if a particular employee is doing locomotive inspection, I should be able to go to their training records and see that they've been trained under 49 CFR Part 229, probably Part 232, 223, so on and so forth. All those federal regulations that apply to a particular employee that he or she may be responsible for applying in connection with their duties. Next slide, Katie. There was a big, I would think, a significant interpretation or relaxation of our interpretation of what has to come to FRA that was published in the compliance guide. And we're not going to go through all of them, but I would encourage you to look at that compliance guide. Katie's providing you the links, pages 8 through 11. Everything on those pages 8 through 11, you no longer have to submit under Part 243 to us. You can keep them on property, keep them on your in-house. If we want them, we're going to ask for them and come see them. That's what we expect to find what we need. The only departure from that, as I mentioned earlier, is that TO and LIs still have to submit all their programs to FRA for review and approval. But all those references that you see on pages 8 through 11 with respect to a specific CFR part, that's because they already have a training mandate within that regulation that would essentially relieve you from providing that information to us again, or actually giving it to us in the first place. So we're going to be satisfied with you keeping those programs on property and available for inspection when we ask for it. I just want to caution you there. Let's just take one rule, for example, that appears on those pages, Part 218. So Part 218 generally has to do with tampering, and you have blue signal protection in there, and then you also have this bit about Subpart F, handling derails and switches. That's a relatively new addition to Part 218. Within 218 Subpart F, there is a segmented, separate training requirement under that, but there is no training requirement for tampering or blue signal application. That's an older piece of Part 218, so just be aware, and it's laid out cleanly on those pages. Just be aware that you do have a requirement and a duty to provide it to FRA, a program of that particular piece of Part 218, because there is no standalone training mandate within that particular CFR part. I hope I didn't confuse you, but I would ask that you study those pages closely to make sure that there are no separate pieces within a particular regulation that would trigger a submission. And you can cross-reference that with the OJT training matrix, or just as a job aid to tell you, okay, maybe I should look to submit to FRA a particular piece of a regulation. Look at that, study that, and if you have any questions, feel free to discuss with me. Periodic oversight applies to all employers. Again, this is of the FRA regulations is pertaining to work group safety. What do we mean again by work group safety? Okay, so this is a narrowly focused oversight requirement that applies under Part 243. We're talking about Part 218, we're talking about 220, and we're talking about Part 214. All of those three regulations, and if you study the regulation itself, it actually tells you that. But we don't ask you to go outside of that. You certainly can if you want to, but the area of focus for periodic oversight applies to those three regulations. Obviously, it does not include train and engineman because they're already covered under Part 217 for periodic oversight under efficiency testing. When does oversight begin? January 1st, 2020. If you want to combine it, that oversight piece the oversight piece that's required in Part 243, you can do that. All you have to do is tell us, but you can combine it with your existing operational testing requirements under Part 217. Also ask you to be aware of the contractor oversight provisions, where the contractor's on the hook if they have 15 or more employees, train its own employees, and qualified supervisors to conduct oversight. I will just fall on my sword on this particular, these three conditions. All three of these conditions have to be met in order for the contractor to be responsible for the oversight. Clearly, there was some discussion in the working group when we wrote the rule about railroads didn't want to be responsible for contractors on their property for conducting the oversight. I think as a railroad, if it was me making those decisions and I was hiring a contractor, I would make damn sure that those three, if I didn't want to do the oversight, that those three conditions were met as a condition for hiring that contractor for service. That's just Rob talking here, but I think we could have done a little bit better job on this particular piece of oversight, but it is what it is. Just be aware of those three things there for a contractor. If they can't meet any of those three requirements, essentially their responsibility is going to be on the railroad. Okay, next slide, Katie. First annual review will be due by September 1st, 2021. You can also combine this with the review that's required under Part 217. This started with that actual Subpart F thing back when Subpart F came into being. I think it was around 2003, 2004, somewhere around there, where FRA thought it would be great to federalize the handling of derails and switches. Anyway, if there's an annual review requirement in that Subpart F, if you want to combine that, you certainly can. And we just offer up some possible data sources for what you're looking at. When you're doing these annual reviews, what are you supposed to be looking at? What kind of analysis that you do? I'm sure that you have more than what I have listed here under these 5 bullets. You guys probably have all sorts of safety metrics at your disposal on property, but we listed a few here just to give you some ideas of where you're supposed to be looking when you're doing your annual reviews. And what's the whole point of doing annual reviews? The idea is to tweak your training programs. Are you targeting the right areas for training? Are there gaps missing? And that's the whole focus and the whole point of doing an annual review is to do a systematic review of how you're doing things. And if you see performance gaps of some nature, then sometimes training is the proper intervention. Sometimes it's just coaching and feedback one-on-one. But oftentimes, if you're seeing systemic things, then you would look more broadly at some of your other safety metrics to include some of these things we have here to see whether or not additional training or some tweaks in your training programs might be necessary. I'm not going to go through the next slide. I'm on slide 9, Katie. Just some things in the guide that we called out specifically. Again, the big one is on page 8 through 11. It's all those regulations that you are now relieved from having to submit under Part 243. We shortened the section by section guidance to reflect the simplification of the website. If you've noticed, if you've been in there lately, it probably looks a little bit different to you. It is a much more stable environment. It was written under .NET, whereas before it was under SharePoint, which was nasty for us. I think for all of us to try to manage. I think as this thing goes on with this portal, we'll find it even more user friendly. I think improvements can be made, and we do have funding for another release and some improvements to make that simple. When I issued the compliance guide, let's see, that would have been in 18, I inadvertently left out 2 sections that actually mention refresher training, and I corrected that table that appears on page 22 and 23. And then let's go to the next slide, Katie, if we could. Added some more FAQs. I think these FAQs are pretty handy. Again, if we have some questions today that will make the cut, if we think it'll benefit the entire industry, we would like to include these FAQs, questions like that may come up today, into this document to memorialize and give you guys some comfort about FRA's position on certain matters. So we added a couple of on-the-job training for designated instructors, some contractor compliance questions, plant railroads questions, and then next slide, Katie. This is the petition docket. I would encourage you to click on the link that appears on your screen now. The big thing is if the link doesn't work, or just regulations.gov is what you're looking for. If you just, after the / is the actual page where that docket resides. But you can simply search on that FRA dot control number, FRA 219050, and get to it as well. Some additional resources, we have some sample courses. We have the OJT matrix that used to be, I thought was cumbersome to use. It did print a nice report, but you could only query on one occupational category and one craft at any given time. Now it's actually a spreadsheet. You can filter to the cows come home, and unlimited filtering capabilities without XLS. That's the very bottom one at the table that you're at, the accordion that you're looking at now. When you click on that, you'll get the link to the spreadsheet that would enable you to see what FRA was thinking in terms of where we think formal training is appropriate, where we think OJT is appropriate, where we think maybe you just have a discussion or hand somebody a piece of paper, and we call that a briefing. I'm not going to claim, we have some disclaimers in that OJT matrix about this is what we think. If you guys think that we're off base, let's have a conversation about it. We've been doing this a lot of years with FRA regulations in terms of training up people to apply FRA regulations. I get it that it's different for railroad employees, but we are talking about FRA regulations. The big thing here in Part 243 is OJT, and we think we have a pretty good handle on it, but if you guys disagree, let's talk about it. And on OJT, I just wanted to emphasize again, I did put a comment in the guide about it, that we don't necessarily believe that the traditional approach to OJT in the field is the only way to get it done. With technology, new technologies that are emerging with virtual reality and near virtual reality and simulations, we also recognize that there's things that can be done in a safe environment, in a laboratory, in a classroom, either through simulation, either through role play, or the technology that I've seen some of the Class 1s using with VR and near VR. I think that's exciting opportunities. We will consider that as a demonstration or to be equivalent to OJT on a case-by-case basis. Again, let's have a conversation about it. Let's see what you're doing. And to me, at least, it seems that if we can remove a lot of the risk out of getting people qualified, I think that's a good thing. But we're not going to sit here and say that everything is going to be okay. We want to be able to evaluate each one of those new technologies on its own merits. We have other stakeholders that we have to consider. It's not just FRA and the management side of industry. It's also labor that we have to consider in many cases. Again, I just wanted to comment on that. We also have our OJT templates up there. Again, they've been tailored for the industry approach of how to apply OJT for federal regulations. They're just templates. We think they're pretty stable, but if you want to have a conversation about it, we certainly can. There are 4 of us in my division. They are listed on the next slide. For myself, Mike Sanders, Brian Riley, and Corey Johnson. We are a small group, but we're actually staying pretty much on top of the submissions that we've received thus far. We have never had an instance where we have issued a declination letter saying your program stinks, start over. We always have a conversation about it. We'll call the submitter and say, you need to do this or that, or what do you mean by this, or can you do this, that, and the other, and get this corrected. We will. I know we won't have that kind of flexibility going forward because they're coming in fast and furious, but we will always try to have a conversation with you first before you see an outright declination letter. Okay, so we have the questions here now.
Sounds good.
Okay. From a Class 1 railroad, and I'll just read it, or do I need to read it, or do you want me to just answer it? What do you want to do?
I think you can. I can read it real quick in case there's others that are called in and don't have the access to the screen, but I have it up. So
okay, go ahead.
Class 1 asks, we have contractors that need roadway worker protection. They train their, let's see, for contractors, let's see. They train their own employees, but when they're ready to test, our instructors administer our exam and report the results to the contractor's supervisor. Does 243 change anything for this scenario?
Okay, yes and no. I will say this about what I see there in that first sentence is the roadway worker in charge. We've said, and our OJT matrix states this, that if you're a roadway worker in charge, you have a little higher level of demonstration to prove that you actually know what you're doing and that you can demonstrate that you can protect people under your charge safely. And we want to see a little bit more rigor for the roadway worker in charge for everybody. And we're looking for some kind of hands-on piece. Again, it can be the traditional field demonstration, it can be maybe a classroom simulation, or it can be both, whatever the case may be. But since the sentence does include RW, roadway worker in charge, our position does require a bit more rigor for not only that person, but for a flagman, a watchman lookout, or a lone worker. We want them to be able to demonstrate, basically because of the casualties that we've experienced over the years with these particular work groups. We want them to have a little bit more higher level of understanding of what RWP means. The second part of the answer is yes, you can continue to do what you're doing now. Since RWP has an existing training requirement, you don't have to send anything to FRA for review and approval, at least under Part 243. But when we do come looking, and we will come looking at some point, especially if somebody complains or if there's an incident or some sort, we will come looking. And if you have people that are acting as roadway worker in charge, lone worker, watchman lookout, we want to see a little bit more rigor in how they're trained. I know that roadway worker training has been the standard. I think it's anywhere from a 2-hour to 4-hour video that a lot of contractors have been looking at under, I think it's contractorsorientation.com or something like that. For the average roadway worker that's not acting in any kind of capacity that I just mentioned, any of those other categories I've mentioned, that's fine. You can continue to do that. But if you have somebody that's going a little bit above that in those categories, then we want to see a little bit more rigor. Sorry for the long-winded question, Katie, but that's something.
No, it's good. Thanks for clarifying that. I was wondering a couple things to clarify. I think sometimes contractors use the language that they have a roadway worker in charge, but in reality, they're working under a roadway worker in charge of the host railroad. So they just have someone designated within the contractor, but they're not really the employee in charge. I don't know if that makes a difference. I would think it would.
Yes, it does. And you are absolutely correct. It's not common. It's very uncommon, as a matter of fact, for a contractor to be acting as a roadway worker in charge. It does happen from time to time, but it's rare. If they're not acting in that capacity anyway, or lone worker, watchman lookout, then what they're doing now is continue to do it. Nothing changes.
And I wonder too with this question, and I might be looking into it a little bit, but it sounds like obviously there's not a submission requirement they need because of what falls under that pages 8 through 11 in the compliance guide, where they just have to update their internal records if necessary. But I'm wondering if this class 1 is also wondering if this impacts oversight for the contractor.
Yeah, it certainly could. Roadway worker, Part 214 is part of the periodic oversight piece. So somebody's going to do oversight, whether it be the contractor, the railroad, or both, but somebody's going to do it.
Okay.
That's a given. Next question.
Next question. This is from a contractor, a similar question. We currently receive on-track safety training from a class 1. Do we need to do anything differently when 243 goes into effect?
No, I would just maintain, since the railroad is providing the training, the railroad is generating the training record. I would think from a contractor, if I were the owner of that firm, I would make sure that I would get copies of those training records for my employees. I think that's the only thing I would do different is just make sure that I have the training record for each of my employees that were trained by the railroad.
Okay, and then I'm just checking the chat to see if anything else has come in, but so the third question is specific to the portal. So what's the difference on the portal? There's an option, like I think on the first screen, where you select you're going to submit either an entire course catalog or a new course.
Okay, this came from a large class 1 railroad, this catalog business. The idea probably 4 years ago, where the railroad said our LMS is, we have the ability to punch out a course catalog as opposed to submitting individual courses. And I thought, not sure why I didn't think of that earlier, but you're right, we need to make that accommodation. Here's the deal. There are some LMSs out there that have that ability to generate a course catalog. That basically, a catalog is a book, essentially, or a reference that has multiple courses, something like you would see at a university, a college or a university, where you would look at you would peruse their course catalog and see what courses might be appropriate for you, or maybe one of your sons or daughters to take. And what do you look at when you're looking? What do you see when you look at that catalog? It's the syllabus, and that's the way Part 243 is laid out. It gives you the ability to package all your courses in one volume, and then submit that document to us as a book, as a booklet. I'll just call it what it is. It's a catalog, instead of doing it course by course, individual courses. If you're a large firm and you're managing many courses, if you're a large employer and you're managing many courses year in and year out, the catalog option is probably for you. You would simply package your courses in a catalog fashion, maybe publish it as a PDF, and essentially you're just uploading a document to FRA that's a catalog. You name your catalog. You go to the next screen and say, I attest that this is the best and true to my ability, and you hit submit and you're done. The one caveat here is that every course within that catalog still has to have all those informational requirements that are laid out in Part 243, 102, and 103 and 105. 102 and 103 and 105. All that information you have to have in the catalog. Okay, you're not off the hook of having all that information that's required by Part 243. On the other hand, if you're a small entity and you only manage maybe a half a dozen courses a year, then you probably don't want to do a catalog. The web pages are laid out so that when you fill out the fields on the web pages, you are essentially completing all the information that's required by 243. If you populate each one of those web pages, you are in essence complying with the submission requirements under Part 243. If you do a catalog, again, you just got to make sure that you're filling in all the blanks that you might otherwise do on a course-by-course submission. You can determine where that is. The compliance guide has that information as an example, and I think it's on page 53 or 54, something like that, in the compliance guide that really tells you all the information that's required under Part 243.
Sounds good. Thank you. And then the last question we got ahead of the webinar, and if anybody else has other questions, feel free to chat them in and I'll ask them to Rob. But the last one is, will facilities that manufacture railroad cars for railroads now be under 219 for drug testing? Well, this isn't really maybe a 243 question, but I don't know if it's something you can speak to at all.
I can. I just got an answer from Jerry Powers, who runs Part 219 this morning, and the answer is no. It does not cover those folks. Now, there's some rulemaking going on now. I don't know if it's rulemaking, but they're getting ready to do their compliance guide, and I think it will be clear in their next compliance guide that the answer is no for this question.
Okay, thanks. So as you were talking earlier, I wrote down some questions or things I thought might be helpful to clarify. So one of them is for learning institutions. Certainly starting January 1, I'm one of them, but if there's others out there, need FRA approval in order to continue offering training to the industry. I'm wondering, and I really stay in this, what I offer generally is within the scope of 243, but I know there's others of us maybe that goes beyond what 243 would cover. If you could just clarify if that's the case, I'm guessing we would not need FRA approval if it's beyond the minimum training standards that are in 243?
If you're training somebody how to operate a forklift, clearly that's not an FRA regulation that addresses people operating forklifts. You can do that. You can continue to do that as an example. It's only if you're doing training that applies to federal regulation, namely FRA regulations, laws, and orders, period.
Okay.
So if you're providing other services that falls outside of that, yeah, continue to do.
Okay. Thank you. And then let's see, for briefings. So for those of you that have maybe not looked at the OJT matrix yet, there's 3 categories. There's formal training that FRA defines, on-the-job training, and then a briefing. And I'm just wondering, when we see briefing, would there be any expectation for submission if it's not listed in 8 through 11, or is that just something we have some sort of internal documentation for? Because for me,
Yeah,
having it not meet formal training, I'm not sure what we would have to submit.
yeah, I think that's our way of telling you that we can, and I don't want to try to marginalize what briefing is, because it could certainly be a valuable piece of information. But I don't think I'd get too concerned about, what that looks like in terms of documentation. Let's just say this. Let's see, see if I can think of an example off the top of my head. Okay, I think one of the things that comes to mind is something simple like maybe a little stick. Go ahead.
I was thinking like, I don't know, I'm thinking from memory, but like some of the reflectorization or some of those sorts of car standards, I think there's briefing in those, for example.
And that's just all awareness stuff, I believe. Most of that stuff is done by manufacturers, and I know there are some class ones that are involved in it, but for the most part, you're right. It's not something that we're going to be looking for necessarily. It's just handing somebody maybe a fact sheet, information sheet for them to read at their own leisure. Maybe it's a conversation in classroom, and that's that. I don't necessarily think it's that big a deal in terms of documentation.
Okay. Maybe it's a slide within a classroom course or something
Absolutely.
like that.
Yeah.
But you're not looking for them to submit it. There would be nothing really to submit. It wouldn't meet the portal requirements.
That's right.
Okay. I think I just wanted to clarify that one. And then annual reviews, we did have a slide and we talked a bit about those, Rob. And again, I'm going from memory because I'm running the webinar, so I wasn't able to look it up. But am I right that contractors aren't under that requirement, or I just want to clarify
I'm sorry, you're right. I didn't mention it. I should have. It's just for railroads.
And then as you were talking about it, you were talking about how it would inform improving training programs, but I was also thinking the annual reviews will likely inform what the refresher training looks like going forward. Is that what you were?
Absolutely, yes, certainly. Spot on.
Okay, I still don't see any other questions. If you guys think of something, feel free to chat them in. Otherwise, there is the FRA email address, and at the very end, I'll bring back that slide. We have a little bit of time. What I was thinking, for those of you who've worked with me in the past, this might not be very beneficial, but for those of you who are still preparing for their initial submissions, I wanted to provide a high-level summary of the process I go through to do that, in case that helps provide your project some direction. Rob, if it's okay, I'll go ahead and start talking through that from a high level. As I said when we kicked off the webinar, I've done this a handful of times. I feel like I've gotten this a bit down to a science. And really, it's just to find, like, how do you get started when we're thinking about all the requirements that Rob's really talking about, especially from a priority perspective, making sure you're compliant with those January 1, 2020 deadlines if you're a large employer. And if you're a smaller employer, I don't know what's going to change with the petition, and hopefully we'll know that in the near future, but this also may be useful as a way to approach training requirements as a whole. What I do is generally first I want to define the scope, and this is the process, and I'll walk you through this in a little more detail, but I try to define the what. The regulation defines safety-related tasks, and that's the scope of 243 from the training content perspective. And Rob's on mute, but I have a feeling, Rob, if I say anything incorrect, please jump in. But for me, that's the what, is what are the safety related tasks that impact your organization, or if you're looking at it from a department perspective, your department. Now, of course, the other part of the scope is the who, which is the regulation defines safety related employees. And those you can find both in the compliance guide or in the regulation themselves. But together, those define the scope of what 243 is going to be for your organization. I walk through those processes first, and then I identify how are you currently training that content, and then is there any content gaps, and then quality gaps, because 243 does have specific training standards embedded in it. You want to make sure that you're meeting those. And that might seem like a lot. I feel like it takes me about a half a day to go through transportation, a half a day to go through mechanical, and a half a day to go through engineering. I'll give you a glimpse of what that looks like. It might take you longer as an organization if you haven't done it before, but it's really not as overwhelming as it sounds, I think, if you can take this approach. First, we're talking about the what, and you'll see I have just a screenshot of a spreadsheet that I've used in the past. And the second column is the what. Now, I'm an instructional designer, so I tend to write the what as a learning objective or as a task, so I can easily just jump that into a terminal learning objective for a classroom course. It takes a little extra time on the front end to rewrite the regulation and what it means to your employees, like what they need to know or what they'll need to be able to do, which is what I've done in that task column. I think it's great if you have the time to do that. It will really help you out in the long run. But if your time is short, I think starting with the FRA OJT matrix, you could put that column in there in the what, and that's really just by the paragraph of the different regulations that are under the scope of 243. Either way, you could try to reframe those into a task or a learning objective, but otherwise start with the OJT matrix. And then once I have those, we talk about, you can see I have different columns for different employees. You may need to group your employees together before starting this process, or this process might help you group your employees into larger categories. I would recommend doing this by operational group. So start with mechanical or transportation or engineering, but I would do it 3 times because it gets a little bit overwhelming on the spreadsheet to try to get all employees on the same one. But we talk about, okay, we're looking at 214 on-track equipment or roadway maintenance machines. Who needs to be able to recognize that there's FRA non-compliant defects? And ask that question, you put a check next to the employees that would apply to. At the same time, I identify if it's a task or knowledge, which is my way of saying classroom training or formal training, online training versus OJT. Oftentimes I'll have another column, it's not shown here, of what the OJT matrix from FRA is showing as a reference point. And I often put the CFR rule as well. And then the how is, how are we currently training this content? And I have that in column 3 because I do that last, but I like having it on the left-hand side, which sometimes there's nothing to put there. Every now and then you're not sure, or sometimes there's multiple courses that train the same thing. So at this point, it's just gathering that information so you can start defining the scope of your submission. And if I would say if there's multiple courses, you don't necessarily need to submit all of them if they're all being trained for the same employees. Like maybe one is really introductory and the next course really covers the requirement and the third one goes above the requirement. Those are all things you can look at next, but I just gather that information through this process. Then together you can summarize this. So I'm just going to go back. Once you have all of that, you would have all your courses. You could remove duplicates. It would show on the right who should be taking those courses. They may or may not be currently taking the courses. You'd want to make sure that you would align your curriculum and your training program so that is the case. And then that allows you to summarize what your submission is going to look like. So you just want one line for each course, what CFR part it's covering, and who's going to take that course. These are courses Spark has, but likely they would be a lot more internal courses that you're using, or you might have different vendors potentially for different components. Just make sure that if you're using vendors today that they have that FRA approval that we talked about, and you can get the approval letter on the 243 portal. You can log in and access the FRA approval letter, and I would encourage you to do that because when FRA approves each course, they may have commented or clarified what the approval means. Like for example, I have some OJT courses approved, they're just checklists, but there is some requirements on the employer side to make sure that they're doing the right prerequisites and then clarifying what the requirements are for the employer to complete the OJT. So those FRA approval letters would be helpful, I think, if you're planning on implementing the model program. just providing, so there is a requirement to categorize employees in the regulation, and this is the template that the class ones we created a long time ago. It doesn't have 272 on here because we did it before that was published. If you don't have a copy of this, I'm happy to share it with anyone. Just send me a note and I will email it to you. Just take it with a grain of salt because it's dated. But this is another way of summarizing your submission from both an employee category, occupational category perspective, and then which CFR parts apply to them. Now, originally when we did this, we had blue for 240 and 242 because we knew we weren't going to need to submit that. Now that's a little more complex with the changes in the compliance guide from May. As Rob talked about 218, you might want to put 2 columns for 218, the parts that you would have to submit and the ones that you wouldn't. I think that would be helpful. And once you've identified your scope, and I'll go back to that listing of courses. So if you have a list of courses, the next step is to make sure that the training meets 243 standards. And these are just a couple of tools I've created on Excel when I've reviewed course content. And I've reviewed a lot of it, but some checklists that I use to make sure it's meeting 243 standards or just general instructional design standards. When you're doing classroom courses, one thing I'd encourage you to have is documentation on what's happening in the classroom. Oftentimes I'll see a PowerPoint, but there's usually so much more that happens in a classroom environment than the slides. Having an instructor guide, it doesn't have to be fancy, but something that documents how much time is spent. If there's activities that aren't represented in the PowerPoint, maybe you all go outside at some point and do some sort of lab or field experience. Make sure those things are documented so that you have that as evidence of what your training really is. And of course, if it has on-the-job training, make sure it meets the 243 standards of tasks and subtask conditions and standards. And FRA has some of those examples posted on their website of OJT templates. But I would also encourage you, if you're not going to do OJT because you feel like you can do a sufficient amount of hands-on training, both practice and assessment in the classroom or through a lab or simulation, that you document it in the same style. It's not necessarily required with 243, but for me, I feel like it really shows that you don't need OJT because you're meeting that same standard. And I know I've heard Rob in the past use single car air brake tests as an example of something where you maybe, instead of doing that as OJT, maybe you can do that after the classroom portion's complete, go out as a group and everybody get a chance to both practice and complete one and get signed off that way. If you do something like that, I just encourage you to have similar documentation.
I agree with that, Katie, completely. Document it.
Yeah, because as Rob said earlier, they're open to not doing OJT, but they might question it or wonder why, and that will give you the answer to that question, I would say. From a very quick, high-level overview of the process I go through, that's really what I take people through to identify their scope of their initial submissions. Go back to this slide. Identifying what safety-related tasks impact them, which employees perform those tasks or need that knowledge to complete their job safely, and then how are we currently training it, whether it's a classroom course, an online course, or on-the-job training or combination. And that spreadsheet, when we're done with it, really shows the scope of the submission for the initial training. I was just going to bring back the slide here with, I have the question slide up, Rob, so that's the email address for FRA if you have any additional questions.
Part 243 questions at dot.gov.
And if anyone has questions for me or wants that Class 1 template, back when we built that, we shared it with the short line associations. It's something that's out in industry and has been shared by the Class 1s to both the short line and NRCs. I know that we can share that to anybody that's interested, but again, take it with a grain of salt because it's a little bit dated. So with that, I think we'll call it a wrap. Thanks, Rob. I really appreciate your time today.
Sure, anytime, Katie. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us. Have a good rest of your day.